I want to turn to you, Sara Hussain, first, because you're where the violence has taken place, our immediate news peg for all that's happened. I know an interim government has been sworn in, but give our viewers a sense of how you view what's happened in the last week, 10 days in Bangladesh.
If I could start by saying, I think your characterization and description of what's happened here seems chronologically rather peculiar, because what we've seen in Bangladesh over the last 2 months, starting from June and heating up in July, was a very peaceful student protest right across the country over an issue that could have been resolved through political negotiation and discussion, which a kind of issue which you've had in India also, and where you've also had violence, in fact, following where those kinds of actions have happened, about quotas and about reservations for government jobs. However, that peaceful student movement was responded to with direct live fire and killings of, at the moment, as far as we know, more than 300 people, perhaps many more than that. Bodies have not yet been counted. There are still morgues and hospitals where we still don't have the records. I visited a graveyard today where they're still compiling the data of the dead who came in during the days of the firing on protesters. So I think it's not right for you to start by saying arson, looting, and turmoil and turbulence. It happened because there were shootings on citizens involved in peaceful protest. That's been followed. That's been followed by the fall and the fleeing to India of Sheikh Hasina, the Prime Minister. And subsequent to that, the taking charge of an interim government headed by Professor Muhammad Yunus, the Nobel awardee. Now, that's the situation we're in. And since Sheikh Hasina fled, she fled from the prime ministerial residence. She fled without any arrangements being made for any of her party members, for any other ministers, for any other person in any part of the administration at all. She fled without any arrangements being made by the military for the security of ordinary citizens. This is not an unprecedented situation in that we have had previous heads of government toppled through popular movements. We've had that happen in 1990 where General Irshad fell, and General Irshad fell after a peaceful transition which was negotiated with him, and where he stepped down and he handed over power to the person who was the former Chief Justice, who took over as the caretaker advisor. It's important for you to be aware that all of the valves that were in our constitution for peaceful transfer through a caretaker government were annulled by Sheikh Hasina's government while she was in power. So she left without any arrangements for anybody. And following that situation, the police, who had been until that moment firing on protesters, until that morning, we are still representing young women lawyers who were held in the police station just near the epicenter of the protests in Shahbag in the middle of Dhaka. They were being beaten with rods and sticks up until 1 o'clock in the afternoon of the 5th of August. Sheikh Hasina fled around about 1:30, 2 o'clock. Right. That's the situation we were in. So I think you really do need to recharacterize you're depicting what's happened in Bangladesh. What has happened since the 5th of, if I may have one more moment, yes. What has happened since the 5th of August and since Sheikh Hasina's departure, after those 3 or 4 hours of euphoria when people were on the streets and celebrating her departure, we saw a different situation emerging. There were reprisal attacks, on members of the Awami League. There have also been targeted attacks, it seems, on members of minorities, the Ahmadiyya community, the Hindu community, members of the Christian community also. And in the last day, we've also been hearing very disturbing attacks. I've just heard about an attack on a professor who also seems to have been attacked by some sort of extremist elements. But that's happened because we're in a situation which was left with no arrangements for what happens when somebody flees the country who's been the head of the government. It's a completely, more than an unfortunate, a deeply disturbing situation we've been in for the last 3 days, where there hasn't been law and order on the ground. The police said they refused to cooperate. We had very few military on the street for the first few days. Now we have slightly larger numbers. But we're also facing a situation where all of the institutions of state, it's not just a question of parliament not being here, but all of the institutions of state have been deeply politically polarized and deeply controlled by the Awami League. And so we're also seeing a situation where there's huge resistance to allowing a peaceful transition of power. So it's a very dangerous and difficult situation, but I think we need to be clear about what's happening here. It's not just random mobs running around for days and days on end and nothing else happening.
I'll come back to you, Sara. You've tried to sort of give us your perspective of how you see it from the ground, and we respect that because often distance prevents us perhaps from understanding the complexity of what's happening at the moment in your country. And we wanted to start this off from Bangladesh because that's been the trigger for today's roundtable, and I want to raise the big questions therefore. What makes South Asia so trouble-prone? Is South Asia caught, as some suggest, in a global power play? Why is democracy not taking root in some parts of the region? Is this now a region still plagued by coups, revolts, by fanaticism and extremism? Has South Asia therefore become, as we are calling it, a circle or a ring of fire? These are some of the questions that we will continue to pose, but Sara Hussain has put it in some perspective for us, and I want to broaden this, Raj Chengappa, since it's your magazine that has called it a circle of fire. Sara says, don't look at this purely as from the point of view of the arson and the looting that you've seen. It is also a popular revolt against seemingly an autocratic ruler who did not allow democratic institutions, checks and balances to flourish. Let's not describe, she says, the students as arsonists and looters.
I think, Rajdeep, we have to look just not at Bangladesh and see the kind of troubled neighborhood that we have. We saw the same scenes play out in 2022 in Sri Lanka, for instance. And I mean, it's almost like a mirror image that in Colombo you have the presidential palace being ransacked, and here you have the Prime Minister's house doing it. You look across at Pakistan, and you've had for the first time the Pakistan army has been challenged in terms of the fact that you had the Imran supporters actually storm the co-commander's house in Lahore. You go towards Myanmar and you have a rebellion that has seen almost the junta that is ruling there losing almost half its territory to the rebels. And wherever you look, one of the things that come across is, to answer your question, is that there is economic issues of serious concern, and there is an aspirational youth, and there's a youth bulge in most of these countries, particularly in India, that is unhappy with the way things are going. So if you see what happens in Bangladesh, it's a highly prosperous country till COVID strikes, and it is dependent, its economy is dependent on remittances, its economy is dependent on exports. All that begins to crumble, and you have high unemployment, you have high inflation, and discontent begins to spread. Compare also with the kind of authoritarian rule which bottles up everything. Take Sri Lanka, the same problem. You had the Rajapaksa family have a stranglehold of it, and then the entire economy collapses. So I think the big message that is coming up there is two things. One, that these days there is tremendous amount, the power is flowing from youth themselves who are very, very unhappy. Regimes across cannot afford to take the people for granted, and what we are seeing is the complete economic discontent caused partly by COVID, caused by very bad governance, dictatorships, and other kinds of things that's happened in in South Asia.
You know, as I said, we'll try and explore as many facets of it. Ambassador Omar Samad, you're joining us to give us an Afghanistan perspective, because a few years ago we saw Afghanistan as the epicenter of much of the violence, the fanaticism that resulted in the loss of thousands of lives, the upsurge of terror. Give us your sense as you look across the region. Are you seeing that fanaticism, the extremism, the violence that can be triggered at the slightest moment deeply troubling?
Well, let me just say that I, first of all, appreciate very much the viewpoint that was given from the ground in Bangladesh. I think that is very important. As a student of foreign policy, as a student of geopolitics, geoeconomics, security issues, someone who has dealt with Afghanistan issues for more than 40 years of my life, at some point as a diplomat, I will tell you that there are a lot of lessons that we have to learn. And one of them has to do with dealing with ground realities and taking reality into account in context that we hope will shape not only a country's future, but also the region and the dynamics that it plays globally as well. So in the context of Afghanistan, as you mentioned, almost 3 years ago, we saw another president over there who was very unpopular, whose governance was mired in corruption, and who couldn't end a civil war that had started many years ago, and didn't take advantage of the opportunities that existed. As was mentioned earlier, it's very important to aim for a political settlement when a political settlement is available or the opportunity exists. If you fail, if you miss that opportunity, then the country may head in the wrong direction or in a direction that is undesirable for some. But in the context of Afghanistan, the lesson was we had an opportunity to end that war. ask the Americans and NATO to leave peacefully, and have a transition that was acceptable to most Afghans and that would not create the situation that it has created now, where everything is in one hand.
Okay.
And the whole country is under one command, without much participation by others. So we failed, and we learned the lesson. I think others have their own dynamics. I mean, Bangladesh is not Afghanistan, Pakistan is not Afghanistan, India is not Sri Lanka. Every country has its own domestic internal dynamics. But then there's the regional dynamic, and then there is the global, if you want, sort of great power rivalry.
I'm going to stop you. I'm going to stop you for a moment, and I'll request my guests to be as short as possible because we want to get in as many viewpoints there. Jehan Pereira, there in Sri Lanka, a lot of the images we saw in Bangladesh this week were very similar to what we saw in Sri Lanka just a little over a year or two ago. And the sense is the economic discontent that Mr. Chengappa spoke about is also been reflected in your country. It resulted in anger on the streets. And that's the boiling point. Across South Asia, there are groups who feel left out. And then when you have authoritarian figures who seemingly are impervious to those concerns, people now take to the streets. Is this a pattern that we are now seeing where people are saying, if you don't give us enough democratic outlets, we will come on the street and challenge whoever rules us?
Well, in Sri Lanka, the people came out on the streets 2 years after elections, democratic elections, at which people freely chose the leaders they wanted. The problem was that those leaders failed and to deliver the economic prosperity that people expected. And on the contrary, there were these enormous shortages of fuel and food and foreign exchange. And people came out on the street for 2 months. It was actually quite peaceful. They peacefully protested, wanting the government to resign. And the violence actually started when the government itself deployed thugs to attack the protesters, at which point, after 2 months of peaceful protest, then there was the violence that took place for a very short time. But that again was resolved when Sri Lanka was able to appoint elected new president through parliament, and not through the Democrat, not through people's vote, but through parliament. And that president was able to restore peace and calm very fast. He used the security forces. There were human rights violations. There were excesses, but very few people died in that. And now Sri Lanka is, in a way, we are looking forward to election. Now, 2 years later, we are looking forward to presidential elections. September 21st is the day. And it's quite calm now, peaceful, and there's a lot of optimism that after the elections...
You're saying the worst is over. The worst is over in that sense in Sri Lanka, and Sri Lanka looks optimistically to the future. I'm going to bring in Aisha Siddiqa, because can Pakistan look optimistically to the future? You've got a leader, a very popular leader in Imran Khan, who spent more than a year now behind bars. You've had elections. But the question is, are these elections legitimate in the eyes of the public? That's the problem. Hasina also could claim she had an election, but the general belief was it wasn't free and fair in the case of Bangladesh. Even in the case of Pakistan, when your most popular leader and his party is kept out of the election, how do you expect people to respond when these democratic outlets are being constantly constrained?
Well, let me firstly come and say something that, if you were referring to earlier, you were referring to May 9th and when people came out. They did not attack, per se, the Corps Commander's residence in Lahore. In fact, the Corps Commander who was there allowed them, let them come in, and there was a confusion. And I think May 9th happened partly because of division within the military. There were those who supported Imran Khan and who did not want the traditional political parties, the PMLN, Pakistan Muslim League, Nawaz, and the Pakistan People's Party led by Asif Ali Zardari to come in. So there was a division within the military itself, and people kind of benefited from it. Of course, there was and there was violence, but it was limited kind of violence. There were people were not, nobody died in those protests. Now, the fact is that there is a lot of resentment in Pakistan regarding the 2024 elections. People think that the mandate has been stolen from them. So far, in Punjab and Sindh, which are the two major areas where, in terms of population, more than 50% of Pakistan's population is in Punjab, and it's very critical, and it's also the power center. But the problem is that there's still not demonstrations. People are very unhappy. I mean, given a choice and what they want, I mean, there is this constant pressure. The military feels it, and there is this, kind of a tussle, a political tussle, a psychological tussle, which is going on. People are coming out, people are speaking against the military, people are very unhappy, and that unhappiness is being felt, within the military as well. But is that pressure enough? Unless people come out on the streets is the next question. I mean, unless people come out on the streets, it will not impress the military echelons to kind of withdraw and allow Imran Khan out of jail, or allow him, allow holding of another elections. Imran Khan says he doesn't accept these election results.